Welcome back, everyone, to Progressively Incorrect. My name is Dr. Zach Groeschel, and I am very excited today to be talking about reading, one of my favorite topics to talk about, reading. We're going to be talking with Chris Such all about his old book and his new book that is coming out, and why he's decided to get back and into the really tough and difficult work of putting down your thoughts onto the page. Chris Such, it is so great to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm good, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And so a lot of people know you from, I think, your blog, especially. I've sent your blog, I've spread it around to so many people when you kind of make that great point. Also, these really awesome threads that you do around reading. And you have a new book out. Tell me about what you've been working on.
Yeah, so what I've been working on, in effect, I spent the last kind of year and a half puzzling over this second book. And the question really is why? Why have I written a second book? What do I think the first book didn't achieve that this one, I hope, does? So my first book, The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading, the aim of that book was to introduce teachers to what's now become known as the science of reading, in particular through the lens of a relatively experienced teacher, because I've taught reading to pupils from age 4 up to age kind of 14. And the idea was that once schools kind of had that book, had interpreted it, that they'd be able to then make sensible decisions going their own way about when it comes to reading instruction. The difference with this second book is that since writing that first one, I've worked with hundreds of schools and I've rolled out a particular approach to the teaching of reading. So rather than saying, these are the principles, as long as you follow these, you'll be fine, this second book is much more, this is a practical guide to every element of teaching reading. So if someone said to me, Chris, in a school or across a group of schools or in a classroom, how would you do this? This is my answer to that question for every aspect of reading that you can imagine, from spoken language development to professional development for the teachers in your school, to assessing and addressing reading difficulties, and most importantly, how to structure classroom teaching.
It's interesting because I think the principle-based approach were like the early days of the new movement around phonics, very phonics focused discussions. I mean, we're talking about things that most elementary teachers have seen now, I think maybe too many times. We've seen like Scarborough's rope. We've talked about whether reading is natural. We've talked about, just the importance in general of phonics. Then we know there's like these 5 pillars of literacy coming out of the national, reading panel, but it's never really, we never get really past those initial principles. So are you saying like this new book really is like kind of digging into what needs to be in a reading lesson beyond those principles, and especially not just phonics?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the book itself does talk about phonics. It does talk about if you are in charge of phonics across a school or group of schools, what you need to keep an eye out for, how you might go about making sure that your phonics program is doing what it's doing, etc., etc. But that's a relatively small part of the book because so much more of it is devoted to, well, how do we actually develop all of the other aspects relating to reading that we need to if kids are going to become capable, confident readers.
So tell me about some of those kind of strands. And I want to focus on fluency first. I think it's the missing bridge, the missing link in all of this sometimes. And particularly on this podcast, we've talked a lot about like the instructional hierarchy, like going from acquisition to fluency. But I don't know if I'm even confident in knowing what that looks like practically, like specifically. So maybe we can start there.
So I think the best place to begin with fluency is by thinking about, well, what actually do kids need to do to become fluent readers? So on the assumption that they've learned the basics of the English writing system, or specifically the alphabetic code, or some of the alphabetic code, and how to use it from phonics, they've begun to be able to decode words mostly successfully for themselves from relatively simple books. The question is, well, how do you get from there to being a reader who's reading at pace, if they're reading aloud with a sense of prosody, basically what is allowing for that sense of flow? And the short answer is, as far as we can tell, that it comes down to a couple of things. The first is that there needs to be mountains of decoding practice. You need to build up your experience with the English writing system, and you need to do that actively. You need to be actively decoding words, which if you're working one-to-one with a pupil, nice and easy. You just read together, you hear them read aloud, you provide feedback, you give decoding, feedback on what they're doing if they've not decoded a word correctly, etc. The challenge really is, how do you do that on a whole class level? So the first thing, and I'll dig into how you do that in just a moment, the first thing is you've got to provide active decoding experience for pupils so they can orthographically map lots of words, basically get to the point where they recognize thousands upon thousands of words automatically, instantaneously. The second thing that the research suggests that you need to do, and I think it ties into this first thing, is that you need to provide pupils with experiences of fluency with a given text before they are more generally fluent. So before they are more generally just a fluent reader with basically any text that's in front of them, you need to give them experiences of feeling fluent with a text. And the way to do that is through practice. It's through repetition. An evidence-informed practice related to this that's generally advocated by those who are interested in the science of reading is repeated reading. But the interesting thing behind that is, well, what's the active ingredient there? What is it about repeated reading that develops fluency? And there's some suggestion that it's a mechanism for delivering this active decoding practice. But I think there are some other bits and pieces in there, from my personal experience at least, that suggest there's maybe something more to it about providing pupils with early experiences of success that build motivation over the longer term. So what does that look like in the classroom then? How do you organize that with a group of 30 kids? As I said before, one-to-one, not a problem. With 30 kids, this is where this repeated reading mechanism seems to be most effective, because what you can do with a group of 30 children, if they've got the very basics of decoding, is you can take a relatively short text, let's say maybe 80 or 100 words, relatively simple. You can model it for pupils a couple of times, maybe even do an echo read to begin to introduce a little bit of them having a go at it. And then you can give them the chance to practice that. Working in mixed attainment pairs works pretty well for this from my experience. And they basically rehearse that text 3 or 4 times each, getting a sense of how it feels to read that fluently. And equally getting a sense of how much easier it is to understand what's going on in the text once they can read it fluently. Now you can then discuss the text after that, maybe perform it on some level. But I'm fairly confident that the main active ingredient there is that this is a way with a whole class of pupils that you can provide active decoding practice, where you can give a little bit of feedback, where slightly weaker readers can be supported by slightly stronger readers. It gets us as close, I think, to the benefits of one-to-one reading on a whole class level. And so I think doing plenty of that, I think, 2 or 3 times a week or a little bit every day with our pupils is one of the major things we can do to help pupils make that first step towards being a fluent reader.
Yeah, let me ask some questions about that, some practical stuff, because I'm taking myself back to teaching 3rd grade, 2nd grade, and doing something similar. Like I kind of think of it like in math, where we have math fact practice as like a general strand during my math lesson. During my reading lesson, I've got this maybe Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or every day, this 8 minutes or so that's dedicated to fluency. But now I'm thinking about some of the practical challenges. 1, where do you find these texts? 2, do I differentiate these texts knowing that some kids, I could plug this into AI and ask it to do something simpler, or I could ask it to make the text harder. And then how can I be confident that they're actually improving? How can I kind of measure it? These are all some questions I've always had.
So in response to your first question, so where do we source the texts? I think you can basically use any text as long as you are responding to what appear to be the needs of your class. So for example, I tend to start off with a set of information texts that I've written that are on my blog that I use for year 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. They're roughly age appropriate. I can take a chunk out of that and know that they're learning something that relates to the national curriculum in England. And I can use something like that. I can take bits of poetry. I can take a little bit of a story, maybe a funny or interesting bit of a story that we've been reading as a whole class at the end of the day. What matters is that rather than worrying too much about whether the text is exactly right on that first day that you do it, what matters is that the second day that you do it and the third and the fourth, that you respond to what happened on the first day. So if I choose a text and it feels a little bit too hard or a bit too easy, a bit too short, a bit too long, to provide pupils with the 3 or 4 times through the text that I think they need, if that's the problem, then the next day you want to be adapting it. So the short answer is you can use almost any text, but if in doubt, you really want to be picking bits of text that are going to be providing some learning for pupils more generally. It can be an information text, it can be a bit of poetry, it can be a bit of a story. So sourcing texts isn't really that much of an issue once you recognize that, look, we can take a little chunk of any age-appropriate text and have a go at it. The second question then is, well, how do we differentiate that? Surely there are going to be some pupils who read quicker, or that we might think of as reading at a higher level. From my experience of doing this, the aim is to differentiate in that way as little as possible. So what I'm really trying to do is pitch the text at roughly what I think of as the middle of the class. Your most able readers will still be benefiting from the repetition, the development of their prosody, and the weakest readers should still be able to access that text because of that repetition, because of that modeling, because of the mixed attainment partner support. And having done this with classes from, age 6 to 7 all the way up to age 10 to 11, I found that to be the case. That said, particularly at the very beginning, so we're talking in England, we'll be talking about, say, year 2, the equivalent of grade 1 in the States, I believe. With pupils of that age, there are bound to be a small group of kids who are still at the very beginning of phonics in your classroom. They've maybe learned phonics for a couple of years, but it's still taking time. They need more support. Perhaps they were absent for periods of it. Whatever it might be, they're kids there that just aren't going to be able to quite engage with that lesson. So what I tend to do under those circumstances, on the assumption that I don't have any extra support from any other adults in the room, what I tend to do is still have them with the same text. I set the whole class off going in their partner reading, but this little group of kids, it might be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, however many it is, they're working with me and we're going to echo read the text instead. I've not found a situation where that doesn't make it still accessible to them. At a push, I might simplify the text. But the thing about having every pupil working with the same text is that you can first build that sense of achievement, that sense that you're working together, but also you can talk about the text. You can ask questions about it without having to say, okay, you guys over here, I want you to focus on this set of questions, and I'm going to ask you this. So in effect, I try and avoid that differentiation by the difficulty of the text as much as I possibly can. Wherever I can, I've got all kids working on the same text. And if I think, you know what, my strongest readers possibly haven't quite been catered for as well as I might like through this text selection this week, then one of the texts that I might use in a week or a fortnight, I might make a bit trickier. I might just say, you know what, this is going to be a bit more of a struggle for those that are still relatively weak. It's going to provide a little bit more for my stronger readers, but so be it. There are always compromises like this in classroom instruction. The alternative, as you say, is trying to differentiate by having 3 or 4 or perhaps even just 2 different texts on the go. And more often than not, what you gain from doing that is outweighed by what you lose. I guess the final question you asked there is about how can you be confident that pupils are improving here? Well, I'd say at the center of any systematic approach to assessing pupils' reading through a school is the use of fluency assessments. The most important thing you can do to understand a pupil's reading is to hear them read aloud. And those fluency assessments provide us with at least some, though it's relatively rough, it provides us with some quantitative expression of the development that that we're seeing from pupils. Alongside that, we're hearing them read aloud, and this is perhaps a bit more informal and less something that we can quantify less. We can get a sense of their developing prosody as well.
Love it. I still have more practical questions, so let's dive into these. I guess one thing, if a teacher's never done this before, I'm picturing a very good literacy teacher, but who basically has like a phonics portion of their lesson. Maybe they introduce a new vocabulary word. Then they go into their kind of so-called comprehension section of their lesson where they're reading text, but they're not getting 30 kids reading at once and reading the same text in a repeated fashion. They're getting a single exposure maybe to a richer text. I think maybe the question would be like, okay, isn't it going to kind of sound weird? Like, is it going to feel robotic? Is it going to seem, are the kids going to get bored quickly of this exercise? Or is it going to be really noisy and some kids aren't doing it, right? That's kind of all the things I think maybe people will be wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of those things play out. When you're first learning to do this, all of those things happen. Getting pupils to read to their partner just above a whisper at a volume where I tend to say to pupils, well, I want you to read at a volume where your partner can hear you, but I can't hear you on the other side of the room. That takes practice. That takes the development of routines. But what good element of teaching doesn't? In terms of pupils not engaging with it, when I first introduced this, I intentionally, rather than doing what I usually do, which is kind of work with a group who might need a bit more support or move around the room to hear readers, when I'm first introducing this, I'm just standing at the front of the room. I'm, to use the Lemovian expression, I'm be seen looking. That's all I'm doing when I'm first introducing this, because I want kids to know that I'm checking up on them, that I'm keeping an eye and making sure that they are engaging with the text. Now, you spoke earlier about mathematics and how you really you love the research into that, the teaching of that. I mean, so do I. It's another one of my passions. With this stuff, it reminds me a little bit of learning kind of times tables or number bonds, or even when pupils are developing a sense of fluency with written addition, written subtraction, written multiplication and division. What you think, the stuff that you think is going to bore kids isn't the stuff that actually bores kids. Kids love developing a sense of competency, feeling like they're getting more expert at something. I find that when kids are switched off, it's less about whether it meets certain aesthetic ideals that I have about what teaching should look like. And it comes down to more about whether they can feel competent and confident in what they're doing. So you can, as long as you are providing opportunities for kids to succeed, I find, and dare I say, talking about this as not just we're just repeatedly reading, but we're rehearsing, and then we're going to perform this together as a class. And maybe I'm going to give some of you a chance to read aloud. With those facets involved, I don't think it does become particularly boring from my experience. Pupils tend to be pretty engaged with this stuff. That said, I'd be really careful to make sure that this wasn't the only way I was teaching reading across a week. Because if it was, then there might be an argument for actually, is this really, firstly, is this addressing all the different reading needs that pupils have? But secondly, yeah, is it going to get a little bit more stale if this is every day? It's almost never the case where I would teach this kind of reading 2 days in a row. I would do something like this, say on a Monday and a Wednesday and a Friday with year 2, perhaps twice a week as pupils get a bit more developed. And then as they move towards the top end of primary school, so 9 to 11, I'd be more likely to do this maybe once a week. And so as their expertise develops, I'm fading this out anyway.
And the alternative, I think, to all students reading at once, or 50% of students reading at once, if you're doing partner reading, is kind of like a round robin or a sort of popcorn reading approach where the teacher's controlling the game, but there's a single student that gets chosen to read. And it's, for me, it really the most convincing part of why we need to do this kind of fluency type of teaching is that if you do the math on it, some kids may read one time verbally through the entire week in this type of format, right? Or maybe once a day at the most. And you get full lessons where some kids never read, or they opt out of reading, they're embarrassed to read, where I feel like this is a way that, hey, we're all doing this and no one's listening to you. Like, you're not singing solo, right? You have a chance to kind of lay low in the crowd of everyone reading and just focus on your reading without all eyes on you. I think it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that point you make about embarrassment there is really essential, because so often when I've worked with teachers on this kind of reading, they say, well, I like the idea, but if towards the end of the lesson we're all choral reading, or I'm asking a pupil to read aloud, or a group of pupils to read aloud, they're never going to do that. Kids hate read, or lots of kids hate reading aloud. And having done this over years, especially with struggling readers, I'm convinced that we've kind of got it backwards. The reason kids hate reading aloud is because their experiences, their initial experiences of reading aloud, involve them failing in front of all of their peers. In contrast, here what we're doing is saying, well, I'm going to model it to you a couple of times. You're going to practice, completely low stakes practice with a partner. You're going to hear it from them 3 or 4 times, and you're going to practice it 3 or 4 times. And then we're probably going to read the whole thing together before I might ask some pupils to maybe have a go at performing it if they want to. So we actually can generate this sense of motivation. Going back to your initial point, though, about just the experience of it. Yeah, I can't say I'm a fan of what's sometimes called round robin or popcorn reading. There just isn't enough experience of reading actively that pupils are doing. Now, I do think that there's potentially some benefits to pupils following a text while another really capable reader reads. I mean, it's worth noting that some pupils or some kids that are generally termed precocious readers learn to read entirely by just following while an adult reads aloud and points to the words. And the idea that that can be so beneficial for some 3, 4, 5-year-olds and then provide no benefit for other pupils, I think is difficult to believe. So I think there are potential benefits to an adult reading aloud, pupils following along with their own copy of a text, but I'd be reluctant for that following along to be where another pupil reads, because that's likely to be disfluent. Your stronger readers are going to move ahead, etc. So yeah, not a fan of round robin. I do think that this kind of repeated reading organized across a class provides that active decoding practice that I talked about, and it can be complemented by ways of teaching reading that achieve the benefits that might be there for round robin without the downsides.
And I think maybe some teachers might hope that silent reading takes care of all this. Like, we don't need to get out these repeated texts and read them over and over again. We should just have kids pick texts that they're more interested in and that they're at their level, self-selected, I suppose, at their level by the five finger rule or something like that. And then just have everybody reading silently. And why is that not sufficient for developing fluency? Or what are the problems with that?
Like, developing reading experience through independent reading is, I don't think there's any way to suggest that that's not going to be beneficial in the long run. But the problem with that is that for that to be beneficial, you already need to be a relatively fluent reader. If you are struggling through text, word by word, no feedback, no support, you're struggling to make sense of it because of the lack of fluency that you have, you're not going to read. If kids just end up looking at books and pretending. So this independent reading, ironically, is really useful for really capable readers. In contrast, it's less useful for those who are disfluent. So you're not providing them with what they need at that stage in their development if you're just asking them to read silently. In fact, I think that when it comes to the use of silent reading in schools, it has to be done really judiciously. You have to be aware that if you are going to do it at all, then that is time that could be spent with a teacher guiding kids through more challenging text, which is likely to be even more beneficial than independent reading. So you have to justify independent reading on slightly different terms. For example, you might say, well, this is just a really wonderful, pleasant experience that we feel that every pupil deserves that to have the right to. And we know that some kids in our school aren't going to get that at home. They're not going to have a peaceful place to read. We just think this is an experience pupils deserve to have, so we're going to provide it. Or you might say, well, we explicitly want to develop certain habits of independent reading that we hope will translate to the reading kids do at home. So a little bit of input at school might lead to something like a much larger payoff. But if you're thinking of independent reading as this is how I'm teaching reading, there are almost certainly more effective ways to go about that as a teacher.
Love it. And one thing I noted from our questions here, right? What needs to be incorporated into reading lessons, especially like beyond phonics? Two things you mentioned were breadth of text experience and text discussion. Can you speak to those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. If I may, I'll take it back just like a little step, because when I think about what needs to happen in reading lessons, and when I talk about reading lessons here, I'm going beyond phonics, spelling, spoken language development across the curriculum, and thinking about maybe a discrete block of your timetable where you're focusing on specifically developing pupils' reading capabilities. Now, what I found in English schools and from conversations with those in both North America, Canada, in some cases Australia, etc., are certain patterns. And those patterns tend to be that, as we've discussed, people were pretty set that they need to do something about phonics, have very little idea about what they really need, what needs to happen next. And mainly the way that schools teach reading is that they've reverse engineered something from the way that assessments look. So they've got a certain kind of comprehension assessment and they say, oh, okay, the kids who do well at those assessments are able to answer what are deemed to be inference questions or prediction questions, or they're good at retrieving from a text, or they can order the events in a text. Basically, I can make them good at this test that measures or that purports to measure reading development, comprehension assessments. And the problem with that is that while it might give a very small boost to those reading outcomes, if you're focused on that, in terms of what actually allows pupils to succeed on those assessments and to be a better reader, the vast majority of it is actually how fluent are the kids and how much do they know about written English and the world that it describes. So in terms of like, how do you go about teaching reading? Lots of schools through this reverse engineering have created a form of reading instruction that actually involves very little time spent with eyes on texts, very little actual reading. There's often not much attention paid to the texts that pupils are engaging with. It's little snippets, often fairly randomly chosen, so there's no variety. There isn't this explicit focus on decoding experience that we can get from the kind of fluency lessons that I was describing before. And it just ends up being quite a stultifying experience for all involved and basically ineffective. In contrast, what I think needs to happen is, like, regardless of the precise way you go about teaching reading, I think that these reading lessons have three priorities. One of them we've already talked about. You need to develop fluency through active decoding experience, through something like repeated oral reading, those kind of activities. The second thing you need to do is, in the time that a pupil is at your school, they need to have experienced a shed load of text. They need to have seen loads of wonderful, varied books and other texts that you have explicitly chosen because of the content that's within them, the language, the variety of that, the perspectives that are discussed, etc. And the third thing you need to do is you need to engage them in text discussions. Now, the reason for that is that through text discussions, you're able to make use of one of the most important resources in the classroom, which is you as the teacher and the knowledge you have of the English language and your knowledge of the wider world. You're able to guide pupils through a text, work out what they do and don't understand, provide that in the moment. So you can explain things, basically. But beyond that, through the questions you ask and the discussions you have with pupils, you can do other important things. You can start to give them a sense of who they are as readers. You know, what do they like? What do they understand? How does this reading connect to them? How do they differ in their opinions to other pupils? And beyond that kind of development of their own identity, you can help them to be active in their comprehension. You can say to them, like, what's the author doing here? What were they trying to achieve? Reminding them constantly that they've got to meet the author halfway, that reading is an act of communication and they have a degree of responsibility. Put another way, you can introduce them to what's sometimes called comprehension strategies through the questions you ask and the things that you practice, which are basically there to remind them constantly, to nudge them that, you know what, there is an onus on you. There is a responsibility on you to be actively making sense of text. So you've got to balance those three things: explicit fluency development, making sure kids experience a really wide amount of varied text chosen for that reason, and text discussions that help them to recognize their active role in reading, help you as a teacher to share what you know about the English language as well. So yeah, I think any approach has to balance those three things. And crucially as well, it needs to think about, depending on the level of capability of your class, how much of those three things you provide it. So when kids are right at the start of their journey to fluency, you probably don't need quite so much of the text discussion stuff. You need more of the fluency stuff. But as your class become more fluent, they don't need quite so much of the fluency stuff. And as they become increasingly mature, they're ready for deeper and deeper text discussions that really get into things like authorial intentions.
Oh, I love it. And I think we've discussed this before online, but it's really contentious how prevalent, the extent of how prevalent this kind of snippet-based teaching is. And in my experience working with schools and how I was trained, this was how to teach reading. A lot of it came down to the resources that were given. The curriculum resources were sort of a single page with the text at the top. The text is artificial, and underneath are questions, and even the format, the margins, the text size, all were meant to replicate what was on the standardized test at the end of the year. The questions fit a certain template that perfectly match the standards that each state sets. So around compare and contrast or around cause and effect, same question types, right? So the teacher is essentially doing test prep every day. They're teaching, this is today I'm talking about cause and effect or main idea or whatever. This is the type of question you would be asked. Here's a small text. We're going to read it once. You're going to answer the questions. And that continued on. I've heard from other people that they've never experienced that they've been working with novels and things like that since the beginning of their career. Yeah, it's just such an interesting thing because it just feels so impoverished, that first type of snippet based teaching.
Yeah, and it comes about through that, I think, from that reverse engineering that I mentioned. As you said, they were trying to align it with these particular standards, and yeah, it's a misconception about what it is that allows us to comprehend. I mean, I had a moment that I remember really clearly at the very start of my career. Before I was a teacher, I was a teaching assistant, and there was a lad who came to England from Poland, and he was already bilingual when he arrived. His parents had read lots of books with him. He'd learned to read, and we dropped him into the end of school assessment. We call it SATs over here. It's slightly different to your SATs, but it's basically part of it is a reading assessment. We dropped him straight into it. Now you bear in mind that all the other kids have been doing tons and tons of this reverse engineered test prep. This kid who's never seen this kind of test before, doesn't drop a mark. He gets 100% because he knows loads about the English language. He's read with his parents loads and loads of books. And we see the lack of importance, really, of this test prep in comparison to the importance of being a fluent reader who knows loads about the English language and knows loads about the world that English language is attempting to represent.
I just wonder how much people feel like they are taking a risk to go away from that type of teaching, right? A lot of it's more improvisational to have a text discussion, right? Because you can prepare through, you put a little post-it notes in the book and you can write down your questions, but often enough, you're just responding to the kids' questions. You're responding in the moment to what's happening in the text and maybe a confused face here or there. And it goes more into the art of how to teach whole class texts, and rather than like having everything sort of already scripted for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big thing is, encouraging pupils to ask these questions and engaging genuinely with what they have to say. If they say something more interesting than the question you planned, then you can take that detour. Obviously, as the classroom teacher, you want to have a clear idea of what you want to explore, but on occasion, you want to take a detour. You want to go to a different route. I think I would be even more blunt about this. I think where teachers are giving pupils snippets and then a set of questions, I don't think that I think you can teach reading that way for a decade and not have developed as a teacher of reading at all. You can get 10 years later and there's nothing there. I remember a while back, I used to teach French as part of the primary curriculum, and I had this program that would be on my interactive whiteboard. I'd basically click a button, it would do the translation for me, and I'd be able to do an adequate lesson for the 20 minutes that we were teaching French. And I did that for a few years, and at the end of it, I wasn't even remotely a better teacher of French than I was, when I first started doing that. And teaching comprehension in this impoverished way is pretty similar to that. In contrast, if you are putting yourself out there and asking pupils questions and genuinely responding to what they have to say, scaffolding when they need a bit more help, or moving on more quickly when you think, oh yeah, they've understood this, you are developing as a teacher in that process. Actually teaching reading in an authentic way is the best professional development that you can do as a teacher of reading. And we are depriving teachers of that when we ask them to teach in this impoverished fashion.
Excellent. You know, and I kind of hope there's just more there's more evidence that kind of comes out around this comparison. It's hard because there's so many elements to, it's so dynamic, this type of teaching. You know, I'm just talking from my experience. I've seen really great teachers doing this, and the kids love reading as a result, and the class feels it just feels like a wonderful place to be a part of. But the teacher is leading the learning. The class optics maybe are they're more facing the teacher, and the teacher's leading it with lots of kind of briskly paced questions, but they just get to dive so deep into text. I just think it's so important.
I'm all on board when it comes to teaching reading, with the teacher taking responsibility for everyone's learning. And as a general rule, I would never divide a class up into groups if I can avoid it. Like, I'm always teaching as much of the class at the same time as I possibly can. If I can teach everyone at the same time, I'm going to, because as soon as you start dividing kids into groups, well, firstly, kids, if there's any kind of grouping based on capability, kids are very quickly aware of that, and they're very quickly going, oh yeah, well, we don't get to read the interesting books because we're not the good readers. And it's very hard to hear, even 6 or 7-year-olds recognize this reality and then still think, oh, this kind of differentiation is a good idea. It's very difficult to think that's a good idea under those circumstances. I mean, more generally, you talk there about the enjoyment. I think if you're not providing opportunities for pupils just to get lost in a book, to get engrossed with it, to read at pace on a regular basis, with a teacher leading the reading and pupils following and stopping points to ask questions and to check they've understood, but then moving on again to keep that momentum. If that isn't at least a component of your teaching, then I don't think you can claim to be interested in pupils' reading motivation or the development of reading for pleasure. That has to be at the heart of what you're doing. Otherwise, really, you're only paying lip service to that stuff.
Perfect. Our next question is how to make changes to how reading is taught across a school. We've seen from the science of reading movement that a lot of excitement built. People have taken letters training. Some administrators and principals are excited about it now for the first time, but then kind of the excitement wanes and it doesn't really get implemented. So yeah, so how to make changes to reading, how it's taught across a school.
So if I may, I'll talk kind of quite generally about how I would make changes to reading. And then I might talk a little bit about the specific changes that I tend to help I do help schools to make. First point to make is that anyone who's interested in implementation, making changes to something in a school, I'd highly recommend they check out the Education Endowment Foundation's Guide to Implementation. It's just really sensible stuff. And a lot of what I'm about to say will chime with that, will align with that, because I do think that it's just really sensible guidance. In terms of reading specifically, the first thing I always advise schools to do is to check that reading is actually the priority they want to focus upon. Because if your reading, the way you teach reading is currently okay, or it's adequate, but the teaching of mathematics or an element of behavior or just your routines across the school for formative assessment, whatever it might be, if they are inadequate, then reading isn't your priority yet. So the first thing is checking, is reading the thing you want to do? And the kind of changes that you're enthused about, perhaps because you've read a book or you've seen a video or whatever it might be, do they fit into your context? Once you're kind of quite confident with that, you need to then kind of sketch out a basic plan. The basic step by step of what you're going to do. You don't want that to be incredibly detailed, because you're going to have to adapt along the way. You're going to have to put your ego to one side as you hit this inevitable roadblocks and the assumptions that you made weren't quite right. But having a basic plan, including a statement of, not only is what's this going to look like, but what are outcomes going to look like if this works, so you can hold yourself to account, That stuff, that's starting with a plan. It's a really good idea. You also want to have some kind of, before you start rolling things out with schools or with the school or having professional development, ideally you want to have at least one teacher, probably the reading lead or maybe another person, having a go at this stuff, just experimenting with it in the classroom, so that when you start to say to teachers, we're going to try this, we're going to experiment with this, that you've got some experience to talk about, so you've got something to fall back on, so you've got someone who can on a basic level model the changes, so that everyone knows exactly what it is you're trying to do. Once you've kind of experimented with it, you really need to start talking with your staff about the rationale for changes. What is it about the way reading is currently taught that you think can be improved upon? How do people feel about the way they're teaching reading? How open they are to changes? An anonymous survey is a really good idea at this stage. Even if it doesn't feed back exactly what you were hoping for, it puts you in a better stead to respond to the kind of questions and concerns that teachers might have. And then I think, thinking specifically about reading, I think you have to begin with a shared understanding of the underpinning theory. Now that links to the rationale. Why are we doing this? Why are we making changes? And in order to do that in the case of reading, I think all of your staff need to have a shared understanding of the basic terminology you're going to be using. They need to understand how the English writing system works. They need to understand what we mean when we talk about fluency. When we talk about language comprehension as opposed to reading comprehension and the integrated bodies of knowledge that allow us to understand what we read, they need to know what we're talking about. So you need to start with professional development that gets everyone on the same page, and then you can start looking at practicalities. So my professional development specifically, if we think back to that list of 3 priorities we were talking about earlier, about developing fluency, making sure kids read loads, and making sure that pupils engage with deep text discussions, what I tend to do is that I will have 3 specific lesson structures. And these lesson structures, a fluency read, an extended read, and a close read, meet those 3 priorities. And it's tempting to kind of roll them all out at once. Whereas what I think is a much more sensible thing to do is to take one of those reading lesson structures, introduce it, and give teachers time to experiment with it, see it modeled, etc. Leave a gap of 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before you start looking at another reading lesson structure. So extended reading is the one that I use to build up pupils' reading experience. I'd leave a 2 or 3 week gap between introducing fluency. Then we look at extended reading. Again, the purpose here is to give teachers a chance to experiment with this new practical way of doing things, to bump into those roadblocks, to work out all of the little problems that are going to need to be troubleshot. I'm not sure if it's troubleshot or troubleshooted, but whatever expression, whatever it is, these adaptations you're going to have to make, you experience them one at a time. So rather than just throwing everything at teachers and saying, off you go, by having these different reading lesson structures, and by staggering them, intentionally leaving a gap in between rolling out each of them, you give teachers a chance to grow comfortable with them, to feel competent and confident in what they're doing. And then once they're competent with all of these 3 and they're confident with them, you can say, okay, now we're going to implement them across a reading week. We're going to have a timetable where we do these things. So that's kind of like the practical rollout of that stuff. All of that stuff, I would say, is like the first half of implementation. Laying the groundwork, working out what you want to do, sharing the rationale, getting everyone on the same page with the theory, incrementally rolling out reading lesson structures so that teachers have time to get comfortable with them, and then putting it into practice. That's all the first half. The second half is the ego-destroying stuff that follows, where you learn that there's a teacher who's in their first year of teaching and they're not ready for anything new because behavior is completely overwhelming them and they need to put a pin in this. Or realizing that you're going to need to make changes to your timetable in order to facilitate this, because at the moment, fluency reading last half hour on a Friday afternoon after PE isn't quite working for a slightly, challenging year 6 class. All of that stuff that follows, all that adaptation, all of that support and monitoring for teachers, all of that stuff is implementation as well. And it's that stuff that so often gets forgotten. You can't just roll something out and then, for the sake of your ego, turn away from it, don't look at it anymore. Once it's rolled out, that's when most of the work begins.
Yeah, and it's really challenging. But you've told me that you've worked with some schools that seem to be getting it right. And I even told you I'm worried that this is definitely a cultural difference with programs, right? The use of programs in the United States, and maybe that even is what launched this discussion in the first place. But I'm worried that maybe this is a task that the average public school just almost can't get right, and that we have to rely more on structured materials. Tell me what that looks like.
The great thing about quite the parlous state of reading in lots of schools is that you can start from scratch and you can build something relatively simple and let something grow from there. I think whenever you're implementing something in a school, and I say this explicitly in the book, you have to start with the simplest version of it that works, because it will become more complex. It will become more complicated inevitably when the rubber hits the road of classroom instruction. So start with something simple. So in my case, and I talked about this a moment ago, I start from the idea of, okay, let's learn the basic beats of a fluency read, which is a repeated reading lesson. And it isn't that complicated. The whole point of it is that a teacher at the very beginning of their career can do this adequately. And a teacher who's much more experienced still has room to grow. There's still room for them to add layer upon layer of expertise the more practice they get. But crucially, it's simple enough that a teacher, an initial teacher, an inexpert teacher, a novice can pick this up and do it adequately. Any change you make in a school has to be something that the most inexperienced teachers can do to an adequate level, because the kids in front of them, this is their one shot at an education. So it has to be something that can be done adequately by the least experienced teacher. Those priorities I mentioned, if you try and build them into one kind of lesson and say, this is how we're going to teach reading, and in this part of the lesson, you're going to do fluency, in this bit, we're going to have text discussions, and in this part, we're going to be reading aloud, it just gets very complicated very quickly, and you can't build it up incrementally. By having these specific reading lesson structures, 3 discrete structures, individually, that are pretty simple to pull off, but each of them offering room for development as you get them, you can roll these out one by one. You can learn just how to teach a reading fluency lesson. You can practice that a couple of times a week. You can get good at that on its own as a novice teacher, and then say, okay, I'm comfortable with that now. How do I do this other reading lesson structure? How do I do an extended read? Well, basically, it's you reading aloud as a teacher with stopping points, brief stopping points for discussion and questioning, but most of the lesson is you reading aloud while pupils follow. You can get to grips with that, but we're going to just practice this bit of reading. We're just going to use this lesson structure. And once teachers are confident with that, you go on to the next one. You say, okay, let's get good at close reading. Let's get good at engaging pupils in a deeper text discussion. Really, all that means is let's look at interesting chunks of text, ideally ones we've already encountered before, so we can dive more deeply into them. And then let's look at interesting language choices that the author has made, and let's find out what you personally think about those texts. Now, each one of those things is very hard to get wrong. There are bits and pieces that can go wrong in the classroom in terms of behavior, and that might need a bit of support from a more experienced teacher to help you kind of get to grips with that. But in terms of adequately teaching all 3 of those, none of them are particularly complicated, but there is loads of room for the development of that complexity from there. So the short version is what that looks like, at least with the schools I work with, is starting with simple reading lesson structures. Now, none of them that I've talked about, fluency read, extended read, close read, I've not invented any of these. These are just things that schools around different countries have been using in different ways for a long time. I'm just saying this is a way to balance them. This is a way to structure them across a week. These are how you might support weaker readers and stronger readers. This is how you might choose adequate texts. That's the kind of stuff that I go into in my book. But the short version is for it to use your phrase, this kind of beautiful, effective approach to reading to grow. I think it works best when you start with something relatively simple and that you roll out incrementally, because that complexity, that beauty of the reading instruction, that will come if you start with something that has this balance and that all teachers can access.
Love it. And I guess like this is the last outer layer. This is like in the air that is in that the kids are breathing, the teachers are living in this, swimming in this water, and that's our last question for the episode, which is how to nurture a reading culture in a school. I think a lot of people don't realize that a structured literacy approach also takes this into account. What do you mean by nurturing a reading culture in a school?
So, in effect, I think it would be very wrong if those who supported whole language felt that they had ownership of developing the joy of reading, or even if it isn't the case that a pupil loves reading, we need to make it clear to pupils that there's value in it, that they can learn new things, that it can support them in their wider endeavors and provide a better existence for them in terms of just their enjoyment and their enjoyment of being a human being. So all of that stuff has to be baked into the way that you approach reading across a school. Now, that all sounds very airy fairy. I'm not sure if you have that expression, very nebulous, if you like. I can be more explicit though. When we're talking about nurturing a reading culture across a school, what we're really saying is I want kids to value reading. I want them to want to become an independent reader. I want them to love reading, ideally. That's an end goal. It isn't always achievable, but that's a really noble end goal to have. And the way we go about that is there's two things primarily. First, and I think most importantly, we have to do everything in our power to make sure that pupils have the chance to become capable, confident readers. That means phonics, the kind of reading instruction I was describing that meets those principles, even if it isn't exactly the way I would teach, that still meets those principles. A systematic approach to assessment and intervention on the basis of that assessment that meets pupils where they're at with regards to their reading barriers. You need all of that stuff, and I hope you'll forgive me for saying all of that stuff is described in detail in my book. But alongside that development of reading capabilities, you need to show pupils that reading is valuable and that it is valued in your school. There's no wrong way to do that, but to kind of demonstrate what I mean by that, let me give you some examples of how you might demonstrate that. You might read aloud to pupils. One of the great privileges of being a teacher and one of the great joys of being a pupil is being read aloud to. Now, I've talked about that in the context of a reading lesson where there might be pauses and brief discussions and quick explanations and questions. But alongside that, you do want a bit of your school day, which is just dedicated to pleasure. Someone who knows their stuff, reading a wonderful story or information text or whatever, or poetry, reading aloud purely for pupils to enjoy it. Now, they are learning loads about written language while this happens as well. So it's got that benefit as well. But you're also just showing kids that here we love reading. This is what you're aiming for. There's joy to be had. Alongside that, we can make books accessible. So I'm not a fan of any system that says, okay, maybe we've got these 500 books in our classroom, but it's only these 30 that are at your, in inverted commas, reading level. They're the ones you're allowed to take home, even though I'm not talking about decodable texts for the moment, because they absolutely have a place for initial reading. But once pupils are at have got the basics of decoding, I'm happy for them to pick up any text. I've lost count of the number of times where a relatively novice reader has fallen in love with reading because of a book that most people would have said is way out of their league in terms of difficulty. Maybe they had to read it 2 or 3 times, but that was the book that made them feel clever. That was the book that they saw their, in inverted commas, clever friends reading. That was the one that made them feel like a reader. So make books accessible. A great thing to do as a teacher to show that reading is valued and valuable is to recommend books to kids. Just to say, you know what, you finished that book. I think if you like that one, I think you'll like this. Making sure that non-fiction isn't forgotten, both in our reading curriculum more generally, but also in our reading corners, if we're lucky enough to have them, in our school libraries. For lots of kids, it's non-fiction that lights a fire rather than storybooks. Along those sides, finding out about the reading preferences of your class so that you can support them in, nudging them towards new horizons, or just finding excuses to talk about reading and to give pupils the chance to talk about reading with their peers. Like, there's loads more stuff that I could mention, but in short, if you are showing pupils that reading is valued and valuable, you are doing some, really good stuff with regards to building this culture of reading in a school. Just that there are a couple of other things, or just one other thing I'd probably mention here. If you can get pupils reading at home, then that is, a massive help, obviously. And so thinking about how you can engage parents with what you're doing with reading at school. Now, that might be inviting parents in so they understand what's going on with phonics or how you teach reading. It might be saying that when it comes to homework, reading aloud alongside maybe some bits and pieces to do with the foundations of mathematics, reading is what we prioritize. Now, there are other bits and pieces that maybe are optional, but this bit isn't. Reading every day, at least a little, to a parent or carer or older sibling, whoever it might be, that's what we're aiming for. That said, we have to accept that the school has the ultimate responsibility for every pupil learning to read. We can't, anyone who says to me, oh, well, in the end, isn't it the parent's job? Well, no, some parents either don't have the time or in rare cases don't have the inclination. Perhaps they themselves have literacy issues. If you are not providing everything in school that pupils need to become a fluent reader, then you're letting down those pupils who don't have that support at home.
Love it, love it. And there's, I think there's just signs of a school not having this culture in place. Like, I think like if I could relate it to behavior, I feel like if I go into a school and as a guest teacher and I say hi to a student and they walk right past me and don't even say hi back, I know there's something wrong if that happens repeatedly over and over again in the day. Something's wrong with the behavior. Where with reading, I see something similar where if while they're walking home and you say to the kids like, "Hey, go home and read a book," and the teachers look at you like and kind of roll their eyes like, oh goodness, like, or a teacher says, I know you don't have to like this, but we have to do this. This is, I know this is the most boring text of the year. We're going to get to better ones later. Uh, and I've even seen teachers that have stopped reading aloud and start using YouTube recordings to read books just to plow through them, right? And I can always sense when something's off, but the opposite is true too when you get to a school and everyone wants to talk to you about what they're reading.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that is the key indicator. If even if a kid is still really struggling with learning to read, maybe they're 11 years old and they're still struggling with the basics of the coding, and you're supporting them to get that what they require, and maybe the next school they go to is going to pick up here we call that secondary school, is going to pick up the baton. Even that pupil, you should be able to ask them like, talk to me about a book you love. Because your reading curriculum and the reading aloud that you do should have provided them with loads of opportunities to be able to say, oh, well, I loved the invention of Hugo Cabret. I loved it when Mr. Such read that with us. It was so cool because, or whatever. You have to be, every pupil, regardless of their stage of development with reading, you need to be thinking, how am I building their enjoyment of this stuff? How am I showing them that there's lots to learn and love about books?
And I think it takes a little bit of work too, like I bringing books home yourself and reading them as a teacher. But when you start to kind of get invested in what they want to read, and or you start to think of these books as movies and you're excited to get to the climax at the end, you start to, I think, enjoy coming to school. You want to get to the next part of the book and you want to see them. Like, I think of Holes as a good book where you want to see them get to that realization, of that aha moment when it all comes together. And
Yep.
yeah, how to encourage that, how to get people excited. It's such a good big question.
I would say one key part of that is when it comes to your reading curriculum, I'm a big fan of saying, in your reading lessons, these are the texts we're going to read. We've structured this, we've organized this because I want every kid to have this variety of opportunities. I want them to have seen books with a diversity of language, content, and perspective. I want them to have seen archaic texts and challenging texts and funny texts. I want them to have seen all that. But beyond that, when teachers are reading aloud to a pupil for pleasure, maybe at the end of the school day or before lunch, whatever it is, I think some opportunities to say to teachers, look, you pick a book or speak to who taught in this year group last year, because they'll tell you what book had the kids in stitches. If you've got a class that you want to connect to, you want to make them laugh, read this book. Or if you've got a group of kids that you think, I want to see if I can emotionally move them, read this book. Having that room to say, I loved this book as a kid, I'm going to read it to my class. And this is just a gift I want to share with them, that, a teacher shared this with me, or a parent or a carer shared this with me once, and I want to share it with you. It's really difficult to have those experiences and then not feel what reading has to offer. I mean, for me, Holes is a great example of that, because that is a book I adore reading in year 6. But the one that really stood out to me, I remember, I think it was in the second year of my career, I read Danny Champion of the World with a class. When I remember having that read to me as a kid by a teacher called Mr. Deakin, and at the time I really enjoyed it, and I remember having kind of weird feelings about it, partly because of the father figure role that was in it and my own personal circumstances. And I remember enjoying the book, but it was only then when I read it to a class that it really connected with me again, and I thought, oh wow, I really feel like I'm like passing a torch on some level, and I struggled not to tear up at parts of it, if I have to be perfectly honest. But I felt, more than in any other part of the curriculum, I felt like on some level I was passing on the torch, passing on like a piece of my childhood to them. Something that had meant something to me now meant something to them. And really, a lot of what we're doing in a school is exactly that. We're taking the gifts that we've been offered culturally, picking the best bits of those and saying, now I'm going to pass that on to the next generation. And I think doing that reading is a really wonderful way to do that. I think once you've shared a book that you loved as a kid, or even a book that you've just, oh wow, I've never been able to make the kids laugh like this before, doing that with a class is addictive. It makes you want to have those experiences with children again. So yeah, I think the best answer to that is reading wonderful books that mean something to you, to the class in front of you.
Perfect. And Chris, I have a feeling people are going to listen to this episode and they're going to be invigorated. They're going to be excited to make some real changes in their classroom practice. Where can they go read your stuff? Where can they pick up your book? How can they get in contact with you?
Oh, so yeah, I'll start from the end. In terms of getting in contact with me, you can find me via my blog, which is Primary Colour, spelt the English way, COLOUR, primarycolour.home.blog. You can find me on Blue Sky. You can also find me on Twitter. My direct messages are open. I always respond to questions that people have. So yeah, just fire them at me. If you want to make changes to any aspect of reading across the school, so it might be how reading lessons work, how you make that transition from phonics to fluency to comprehension, how you can make sure that your phonics is doing what you want it to do, how you can assess and address reading difficulties, how you can build a reading curriculum, all of that stuff is contained in my new book, Primary Reading Simplified. Like how my answer to all of those questions, a kind of real hands-on practical guide to all of that stuff. You can find that. You can pre-order it. It's available from Sage Corwin. It's also available from all of the usual online places, so Amazon, etc. It should be out in January. If that is what you're after, if you're after kind of what do I do, how do I do it, then that's the book for you. If you're more interested in kind of the theory, like the science of reading, there's a little bit of that in the new book, a kind of an overarching summary. But if you're really interested in diving into the research and taking away the biggest ideas from that research, then my first book, The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading, is also available from Sage Corwin, available from all the online places, etc., etc. So yeah, I hope that if you do decide to check out one of those books, that you find them useful.
Perfect. And I'll be putting a lot of that in the show notes of this episode. Listeners, thank you so much for supporting this show. I'm going to keep on pumping out episodes for the rest of this year at about one a week, a few a month. I really do appreciate the support. Chris, take care.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.